Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Facebook Live Lunch and Learn with the Center for African American Health. To ensure our community has the knowledge and resources needed to engage in this upcoming election, we felt it was necessary to discuss the topic of voting today. Now, typically we share resources later on in the program, but I wanted to distribute this link immediately. Please take time to determine your voter registration status today by visiting the Colorado Secretary of State's website at sos.state.co.us. On this website, you'll see a tab entitled Elections that contains important information, including deadlines, a place to review your voter record, and FAQs about the election. We're going to wait a few minutes for folks to tune in, and we'll get started. And while we're waiting, I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the center. My name is Deidre Johnson, and I'm the CEO and Executive Director for the Center for African American Health. We have been working in Colorado for 20 years with a focus on the commitment of improving health and well-being for the African American community. You can learn more about our work and our programs by visiting our website at caahealth.org. As we move through today's session, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will address them if time permits. My guest today is definitely an expert on the topic of voting. In fact, he is the communications manager at the City and County of Denver's Clerk and Recorder's Office, Denver Elections Division, Alton Dillard II. Alton has educational and professional roots in our community. As an alum of East High School, he went on to further his education at the University of Northern Colorado and received a BA in journalism, mass communications. He started his career as a community affairs talk show host at KCNC TV, served as the press secretary and state press secretary for former Colorado U.S. Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, and currently oversees all election-related communications for the Office of the Clerk and Recorder. Alton has been recognized by organizations such as the Colorado Association of Black Journalists, the University of Northern Colorado's Alumni Association, and the Colorado Botillion Coalition. He has volunteered his time in the community, serving on the scholarship committee of the Regis F. Groff Foundation and the boys basketball team at Montbello High School. We're excited to have this certified Colorado election official with us today in advance of the 2020 presidential election on November 3rd. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've heard so wonderful things about you, and it's nice to finally meet you.
Likewise, and yeah, I'm by no means an elections expert, but one of my areas of expertise is sort of taking some of these concepts down out of the cloud and putting them into, usable terminology. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. So a current hot topic is the validity of the mail-in ballot. Many individuals would prefer to vote at the polls, but may be unable to this year because of COVID. Can you explain to us all that we need to know about this process?
Yeah, one thing I'll do is I'll point people towards our website, which is denvervotes.org/voter-info. And it actually there's a life cycle of the ballot page. And what that does is it really shows you how everything happens as far as the journey of the ballot from the time it's laid out to the time it's counted. So you kind of asked a two-part question here, so I'll break that up for you a little bit. Yeah, mail ballots are 100% valid. Here in Colorado, back in the year 2013, there was an elections reform bill, House Bill 1303, that was passed. And what that did was move us to what we call universal mail ballot delivery. Because if you just call it a mail ballot election, that makes the voters think that mail's the only way to get the ballots back to us. So mail's how it's delivered to the voters, and we provide numerous opportunities for them to come back to us. So one of the things that bill did was it helped to alleviate a lot of confusion because we're very data driven. And so there was already a trend towards people using mail ballots, but there were some elections where they were automatically sent. So like nonpartisan elections, like our city elections and school board elections, the way the laws were set up, they were automatically sent. But for a partisan election, you had to request them. So what would happen? Our phones are ringing off the hook. Well, where's my ballot? Well, you don't get one for this kind of election unless you requested it. Well, you sent me one last time. And so what that did was just standardize it, that we send it to every eligible voter. And it also means that from the voter's standpoint, we're not like a lot of other states, and we can get into that as we go through our discussion here. The main voter responsibility in the state of Colorado is simply keeping your address up to date. Now, do you want to dive into the second part of your question about in-person? Because to your point, we are in a pandemic, but as our clerk and recorder, the Honorable Paul Lopez likes to say, you know, we were kind of into social distancing before it was cool. So what we do, we have numerous safety protocols in place. Now for this last June 30th state primary election, we were able to drive our in-person voting down to 1%. So only about 2,000 or so people citywide over a 2-week period cast a vote in person. A lot of that was due to COVID, but a lot of it's also because of how easy we make it. In addition to the fact that for this upcoming election, we will have 38 ballot drop boxes where people can simply, for no postage, drop their voted ballot in one of those. Most of our vote centers will offer drive-through ballot drop-off. And then once we get inside of 8 days to the election, there are 2 key deadlines to understand there. One, once we hit the Monday of the week before the election, we ask people not to mail their ballots back within that window, just to be on the absolute safe side. And that predates all the stuff you see going on in the national headlines. The other thing about that 8 days, that within that window, if a voter somehow, you know, mismarks their ballot, misplaces it, loses it, dog eats it, whatever the case is, they still have the ability to get a replacement, but after that 8-day window, they have to come in person. So we've actually launched a new service where you're able to call ahead the same exact way that you would to do curbside pickup at your favorite restaurant, and you'd be able to obtain your replacement ballot that way.
Oh, wonderful.
And then another thing I also wanted to cover while we're on that subject, if you do have to come in person, know we have protocols in place. We have plexiglass shields that separate the voter from our staff, our equipment, whether it is our booths, our pens, our tablets that we use as vote marking devices for voters with disabilities. Those are all disinfected between every use. We observe the same mask protocols. So if a voter forgets to bring one, we have some of the little blue papery kind that they can wear, but there really is no need to come in person. And another thing I wanted to mention, and then I'll turn it back over to you for any additional questions, is Denver is a designated bilingual county under Section 203 of the United States Voting Rights Act. So because of that, the ballots that we're going to see in Denver are going to be 3 cards double-sided. So think about it, that's 6 pieces of paper. So we're projecting that by the time all's said and done, we're probably going to process 1.2 million pieces of paper in this election.
Wow. You know, it's easy to take things for granted because I'm a Denverite. I've been here for a long time. And the moment we could have a ballot to drop off, I always did. So I never went in person. But I've got friends and relatives who like that in-person process of waiting on that day, which I totally understand. So it's nice to know that we don't really want folks to, but if that happens, you guys are taking the precautions that are necessary.
Yeah, if that happens, we do have the precautions in place because, you know, here's an interesting point. One of my former colleagues is wrapping up a Master's of Public Administration over at CU Denver. And there's still not a lot of information outside of anecdotal information about the voting patterns in our community. But we know that Aunt Irene's going to put on her hat, and Uncle Billy's going to put on his Sunday best, and we're going to show up at that polling place on election day. And so the other thing I wanted to tie back to that is there was a time when we would have a handle on what our election results were by the 10 o'clock news. Those days are over. It doesn't mean that there's any kind of issues. It's not Florida 2000, nothing like that. But our election is not going to be certified until Thanksgiving week. That is state law. We have pre-election testing, and then we have post-election processes that we have to put into place to make sure that everything came out the way it was supposed to. And so we always let people know that, hey, we may be counting ballots 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days after the election. And again, that's normal because we have an 8-day post-election window for any military or overseas ballots to come back. And then also, if a voter forgets to sign their ballot or we can't make out their signature, they have an 8-day window post-election to be able to fix that also. And another thing that we've put in place to make it touch-free, even before touch-free was necessary, now people can fix that simply via a text message as opposed to having to come in person and make that fix in our office.
Okay. So I also want to spend a little time addressing the controversy that's been bubbling up in the news around the U.S. Postal Service.
Mm-hmm.
Many have lost confidence in their local post office's ability to deliver things, especially important things like the ballot on time. What are your thoughts about us actually getting the ballots on time?
I don't think that's going to be a huge problem. I really can't speak for the Postal Service per se, but we have a very good partnership with them. As a matter of fact, even post-pandemic, they would allow us into their facility so we could watch our ballots coming off the semi-truck and go into the postal stream. So one thing, and that's the reason I brought up the length of the ballot earlier and the reason why we don't want people to wait to the last second to cast them, we start mailing ballots out October 9th. So because of the length of the ballot, voters will still get an opportunity to take time and make their informed choices. And I want to make one thing, sort of crystal clear here. We, in the world of elections administrations, we have no dog in the political fight, but anything that gets our voters concerned, like what's going on in the national narrative, we're not going to just let go. And so that's the reason that you're seeing our clerk and recorder chiming in. Even we had a news conference this past Monday with Senator Bennett, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, our clerk, and I'm missing one, Attorney General, and the governor. The governor was there too. And they have sort of a different take on it, but see, the clerk and recorder is the chief elections official of the city and county of Denver, and we want to be able to assure our voters. So one thing that we've been in discussions with the Postal Service about is just making sure that even with everything that's going on, and they're always assuring us, because keep in mind, when those ballots do get there, that first batch statewide at the General Mail facility up on 52nd in Quebec, mm-hmm. It'll be about 3 million ballots. But they say, remember, we're the ones, we process 7 million pieces a day, even without ballots being in the stream. Mm-hmm. So we're not expecting any major delays, but keep in mind that, again, ballots mail out starting October 9th. So that is like almost 3.5 weeks before the election. But we're also, making sure to monitor the situation. We're taking their word for it, but, it's like they say, trust but verify.
So if you change your address on your license, will it automatically change your voter registration address?
It should now, because one of the things that Colorado is moving towards is what's called universal voter registration, where you have that contact with like a motor vehicle office and anywhere like that. But to your earlier point, that's why it's so important that people check their own information. Because one of the things that will happen is if somebody like makes a late move or something, you got boxes up to here in your room. You're not thinking about your voter registration. So it's very important. And actually, I'm going to point you all also towards Vanity that will drop you right into the voter registration section. And that's govotecolorado.gov. And that'll help you get past some of the other FAQs and stuff and really put you into a portal where you can double check your information, look at your own voter registration, make sure everything's up to date.
And also double check your county. I had a friend who moved from downtown to around Glendale.
Mm-hmm.
So address and everything's correct. But when she went to vote, found out, oh, wow, you're not in Denver, you're Arapahoe.
Good point, because there are some unincorporated areas. Glendale's a good example. That area over by the Cunningham Fire Protection District, sort of where Parker and Iliff and all those come together. So yeah, that's a very good suggestion. Make sure, especially if you're moving around within what we believe to be the city and county of Denver, that you just again double check that.
So this election, like so many others, is really important. We also want to ensure that citizens are exercising their civic duty.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, there's always different myths floating around. So I want to mention a few of those to you.
Mm-hmm.
You can help us debunk them.
Yes, please.
First, is it true you can't vote if you're convicted of a crime or you spent time in prison?
That is actually untrue for a couple of reasons. The only people who are prevented from voting are in active felon status. And see, we are committed to removing barriers to the ballot box. So we work with the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, and we have a very good partnership with the Denver Sheriff's Department to actually conduct voting both at the downtown Denver detention facility and the county facility on Smith Road. The other thing that people need to be aware of is the efforts of Representative Leslie Herod in this space. She actually passed legislation that now allows people who are still on parole to be able to vote. Before that bill, because one of the things that happens is people use the terms parole and probation interchangeably, they're not one and the same. Parole is still considered custodial. But now that because of her legislation, even people who are on parole are now able to cast their ballot. Now, there's a 50-state patchwork when it comes to election, and pardon me if I'm using the term, and I'm not trying to be in jargony or anything like that, but essentially in Colorado, once you run your number, you can get your voting right restored. So even if you are a felon, once you are out of the actual facility, and even if you're still in a parole status, you're able to start voting then. And we know, and this is not a political statement, this is just fact, that there is a disproportionality as far as our community and the interaction with the criminal justice system. So I'm glad to be able to get that question on the table.
So we've seen a surge in our population over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that many folks have just moved here from other states. Is it true that they don't need to update their registration?
Well, they do. There's a couple of little nuances there. We participate in a interstate program called ERIC, which is sort of, it's like a national database. That's one of the tools we use to keep an eye on that. And then the other thing that bill I mentioned from 2013 allows us to do is to proactively use United States Postal Service change of address data to help keep our rolls up to date. But one of the things that we do to be proactive is when we get those updates, we send a correspondence to that new voter, because they may be coming from a state where, say, you had to be a resident of your precinct for 30 days to be able to vote. In Colorado, you just have to prove 22-day state residency. And that nudges me on another point, because I did see the headlines in the papers lately that due to the backlog at the Department of Motor Vehicles, people are concerned about their ability to vote if they can't get their hands on a driver's license in the next couple months. In Colorado, photo ID is not required to vote. You have to prove 22-day state residency. You can do that with a lease, utility bill with your name on it, something like that, is still acceptable for voting. Another thing that we always like to make sure to mention is identification is not required to register to vote. So if you're approached by someone with a voter registration drive or something that don't have your license with you, you can still sign up. But then when we mail your ballot, we'll mail you a ballot that's called an ID verified ballot, and it has specific instructions within it to make sure to enclose a copy of one of the state approved forms of identification when you return it, so we can confirm your identity. And if we have some time later, I can really sort of walk through how we identify people, both when they come in person and also in the mail balloting process.
Oh, wonderful. And speaking of registration, the center is going to be doing a voting registration event on September 25th from 9 to 1 in partnership with Central Presbyterian Church. And we'll definitely get more information out to community. But our goal is to, along with the COVID testing, make sure we also add voter registration events between now and that important date.
Yep. So one thing I would like to suggest, and I have this discussion with our Black Greek organizations, we're certainly not trying to create a digital divide. So if you can make sure to have, a couple of iPads or something handy, or even your own cell phones, where people can access govotecolorado.com and register. Because if you run a quote unquote drive where you're actually collecting voter registrations in paper form, because those contain personal identifying information, signatures, addresses, date of birth, all that information, there's actually a required training through the Secretary of State's office that must be conducted. If you have people just plug their information onto the screen, when they hit send, the information is off the phone, it's off the tablet, and they're still registered. So please, any community organizations who are interested in being in that space, please be aware of that nuance.
Thank you so much. So let's see. Oh, here's another myth. If I mail in an absentee ballot, it won't count, and there's no way to ensure it was ever received, so why bother?
Okay, there are two myths involved in there, because one of the things that this legislation in 2013 did, it sort of moved away from absentee, because absentee, there was a time where you truly had to be absent. We sort of colloquially would call those snowbird ballots. Hey, I'm going to be at my place in Arizona over the winter. Can you, send me my ballot? And that evolved into us sending them to all of them. So that's one of the sort of old tried and true ones, because a valid vote is still a valid vote. I've even heard the myth that we would only count mail ballots if an election was close. That's untrue. They all get counted. But here in Denver, and I know not everyone who may be on this live is in Denver, but ballot tracking. We have a program that we pioneered here in 2010 called Ballot Trace. And that allows you to track the progress of your ballot the same way you would track a FedEx or an Amazon package. You sign up for it, and then you can be notified by text message, email, that where your ballot is, that, hey, it's been created. Hey, it's at the post office. It's heading your way. Hey, we got it back. Yes, it's been accepted for counting. Oop, there's a bit of a problem, but we notify you through Ballot Trace that if you forgot to sign your ballot, or we can't make out your signature, we'll notify you through that. And that's how you can know where it is in the process. The state, for those of you who don't live in Colorado, who don't live in Denver, is working on a similar program. I know Arapahoe County has a version of it, and some of the other metros do, but the Secretary of State's office is also working on something similar, so every voter in the state of Colorado, regardless of where you live, will have access to something like that. Now, they've had that technology, but it hasn't been as robust with the two-way messaging. Voters have always had the ability to go on to the state website and see if their ballot had been received or not. But it didn't have that on the way to you Amazon-ish style messaging that our Ballot Trace does. So to sign up for that, it's simply ballottrace.org.
Thank you. So, COVID's affected so much. I know many people, actually I've got relatives who every election they're there to volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
This year, folks who want to volunteer by helping members of the community leading up to the election day itself, do you have any opportunities that you can share with us today?
Yeah, can you put just a little finer point on that when you're talking about volunteer? Are you talking about serving as an election judge, or when you're saying volunteer to help?
I think both and. I think a lot of people are used to being judges. That may or may not be needed if you're expecting lower numbers, but what can we do to volunteer to help?
Volunteer to help. Okay, I think I hear where you're going with this. Yeah, we're always looking for judges, and this is not a partisan comment. This is just a pure voter statistic thing. We're a little light on Republicans. We shoot for bipartisan balance throughout all of our processes, and so we want to make sure that we're being as equitable as possible. We have great relations with the chair people for both the Denver County Democrats and the Denver County Republicans. Other ways to help are to use what we call trusted info. So organizations, whether they be churches, health initiative, fraternities, sororities, anything like that, as opposed to creating your own content, feel free to share what comes out of the Denver Elections Division. Because to your point, because of how transient Denver is, you may have people who just moved up here from North Carolina or Atlanta or whatever the case is, and it may still be in their mind, like for instance, the quote unquote voter registration deadline. We have to fight with Facebook about that pretty much every year, because in Colorado, we offer same-day voter registration. So there really technically is no deadline. You just, again, like we mentioned, you have to prove 22-day state residency. But if you show up at a polling place at 6:59 p.m., you can still register and vote. Another thing that people can do to help is we're very active on social media. And again, we're not working to create a digital divide, because we understand that not everybody is. So another thing we do in that space is we have both what's called a TABOR notice. That's a constitutionally required document under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is actually in the Colorado Constitution. Mm-hmm. So that's created, so any ballot issue that affects debt or taxes by the Constitution, we have to put one of those out. But because we also were starting to find out that people were not sure what they were voting on ballot questions that even didn't affect debt or taxes, and a lot of people were not able to really navigate where to be able to find that kind of information, like on the city council website when they refer things over. So now we do a TABOR style book of just local ballot initiatives that lay out the entire legislative language. Because, there are people, like Kelly was talking about, she's kind of a research geek. So there are people who want to see the wherefores and the there is and the parentheticals and all that. And there are other people who just want to know what is going to appear on the ballot. Shall the voters of the city and county of Denver do X, Y, and Z? So being familiar with that. And then another way, and I have to put this real carefully because this is a question we get a lot from the churches. Under Colorado law, you do have the ability to deliver up to 10 voted ballots per election. But one of the things that can happen is, for instance, we have the drive-through ballot drop-offs that we talked about. And a few years ago, there was this gentleman in a really distinctive car. It was a real sweet BMW, but it was way tricked out. But after the third time he circled the block, dropping off 9, we're like, wait, nice try. Okay, so whenever we see that, one of the churches is going to have a bring your ballot party or whatever, that makes us a little nervous. So just be real careful about paying attention to that state law. But my reason I'm bringing that up is make sure that if you have an elder or shut-in relative or something like that, that you are the one dropping off that ballot for them.
Mm-hmm.
Door to door. I know sometimes campaigns do it, et cetera, but do not give your ballot to someone you do not trust. And again, I want to make a point back on the 24-hour boxes for people who are able to get out to the 24-hour boxes. One of the things that Clerk and Recorder Lopez is really committed to is making sure that there's access throughout what he calls the inverted L. And that's that area that goes up Federal Boulevard to I-70, and it's going to parallel some of the health initiatives you're working on,
Mm-hmm.
Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, and then straight down I-70 to Montbello and Green Valley Ranch. And so we've been making sure, and we've been listening to the community, because like, for instance, we had a box at the Green Valley Ranch Rec Center, and then we had another one at the Montbello Rec Center. But the Montbello Rec Center is on Chambers Road.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing in the core of Montbello. Clerk got wind of that, and now there's one there at the library. So right there, 3 or 4 blocks down from the Allbrooks, just past the fire station, there's one in the core of Montbello. So all this information is available on our website, denvervotes.org, and then also all the locations, hours, all of that information will be in the ballot envelopes that voters receive. So to your earlier question about postal, we always ask people, once it gets to be October 9th, give us, a week up to, weekend. And then if you don't have your ballot, feel free to reach out. But we also want people to sign up for Ballot Trace, because one of the things with ballots that will happen is, because there's so many going in to the mail stream at the same time, sometimes you'll have a case of neighbors who one household will get theirs, but another one won't get theirs on the same day. Sometimes even spouses. And so we just want to make sure that people give the process time to work, but understand that there's all kinds of cushion built in case there's any issue with your ballot getting to you or your abilities to get your ballot back. I always like to use, when you're talking about how to help out others, the example of former State Representative Rosemary Marshall. Representative Marshall is good for pretty much every election that, something came up with Ms. Jenkins down the street at 5:40 on election night, she still wants to vote.
Mm-hmm.
We're there for the people. We have mechanisms, and we have ways. We have an accessible voted home ballot that's accessible through our websites. That'll be live once the ballots go out. We just do whatever we can to remove barriers to the voting process.
Thank you for that. So I have one more specific question and then one general.
Mm-hmm.
Someone has asked, I have a home in Colorado and a condo in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
I will vote in the general election in Colorado, but in the primary election, can I vote in Missouri?
Don't do that. See, one of the things when it comes to determining residency is that's a question we get a lot of the time, also like with the college students. So if Colorado is considered your primary residence and that's where you're registered, don't vote outside the state. You could be setting yourself up for trouble.
Thank you. So when we started, I shared the link to the Secretary of State's office, mm-hmm. so people could confirm their voter registration status. What should they do if they learn they're not registered?
Really, all they have to do is just update in that space that you provided. Because the other thing that sometimes happens is make sure that you're consistent with how you list your name. So
Okay.
if you're registered, but you use your middle initial, just make sure that's consistent. But if you do go on there and say it shows you're not registered or something, just go ahead and fix it. Because one of the other things that changed in that 2013 legislation is it got rid of the status of what was called inactive failed to vote. We want everyone to vote, but before that law passed, if you skipped out on an election, you weren't removed from the rolls, but you were moved into a status where you had to make a proactive outreach to be restored to actually, continue to receive ballots, etc. Now that status has gone away, so you're not just automatically booted off the rolls if you don't vote. But if you go on there, if you have any variations in your name, if you're Tom and you don't see it, try Thomas, because, I've been registered to vote, of course, since I was 18. And that's one thing also, as far as helping others, spread to our youth how they can get involved. In Colorado, you can be an election judge at the age of 16.
Oh,
You
wow.
can now circulate petitions at the age of 16. If you're 17, but will be 18 by election day in an even election year, like 20 and 22 and 24, your 17-year-olds can now vote in the primary. So making sure that our young folks are aware of that. And then when it comes to the voting, there's also the ability to pre-register to vote at 16, and it becomes automatic when you turn 18.
Oh, okay. That's nice to know.
And so one of the things we also like to talk about is, voting is key, but not everyone has that ability to participate in the process. We still have people who are still in process of, say, becoming US citizens, for instance. They can't vote, but there are still ways for them to participate in the process by making sure that they're aware of how a representative democracy works. So we work with a lot of communities. We even work across the border with Aurora, with some of their, immigrant and refugee communities, people who may be on the path, who may not be able to quite yet vote, but still there's nothing saying you can't go out and wave a yard sign on a street corner for the candidate of your choice. Voting is sort of the end game of all this, but we always want to make sure people understand, again, that our concern is that people vote. Who people vote for is up to them, and that's totally confidential.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I've always been proud of our state because I have never experienced additional barriers. And, what we've seen in other states in past elections, it just reminds you of this precious right. And I'm grateful for the work that you do, and that I can take for granted that I'll have some place to go where at other places we can't.
Right.
So thank you so much.
Sure
Thank
thing.
you for joining us today. This was awesome.
Anytime.
So this video will be available along with other information on the center's website at caahealth.org. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next week.
All right, take care.
Take care and be well.